Mark Anthony Callahan woke before the alarm, the way he had for 40 years, even though there was nowhere he needed to be anymore. The bedroom was cold at the edges. The furnace had kicked on sometime in the night, but the heat didn't seem to make it all the way down the hall like it used to. Linda lay beside him with her back turned, one hand tucked under her cheek. Her breathing had a faint whistle to it. Mark Anthony stared at the ceiling and listened. In the kitchen, the refrigerator made a soft clicking noise, then settled. A car passed outside on Maple Street, tires hissing on the wet pavement. Mark Anthony swung his legs off the bed slowly. His knees argued with him, the left one especially. He paused with his feet on the floor, steadying himself with a hand on the nightstand. On the dresser, a framed photo leaned against a stack of folded sweaters. Megan at graduation, her mouth open mid-laugh. Cap pushed back like rules were for somebody else. Ryan in his army dress uniform, shoulders squared and face serious, like he was trying to hold himself together for the camera. Linda had picked that frame. Mark Anthony hadn't liked the way it crowded the dresser, but he'd never moved it. Over the years, it became part of the furniture, like the bed and the lamp and the quiet. He walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. The mirror caught him off guard the way it sometimes did. The face looking back wasn't the one he carried in his head. His hair had gone thin on top, the skin around his eyes crumpled like folded paper. His jaw still had shape, though. He ran water, washed his hands, and braced himself on the sink while he brushed his teeth, moving like he had all the time in the world. The first thing he heard from the kitchen was Linda's voice. "Mark Anthony." "Yeah," he called, foam still in his mouth. "You up?" "Yeah." A pause. "Coffee?" "On it." He rinsed, spit, wiped his mouth, then walked down the hall. Linda had already shuffled into the kitchen in her robe, her slippers scuffing. She stood by the counter with both hands on the edge like she was waiting for the room to settle. Mark Anthony moved around her carefully and filled the kettle. The coffee maker was old, the kind with a glass pot that always smelled faintly burned no matter how often they washed it. He scooped grounds, poured water, and pressed the button. Linda watched him like he was doing something complicated. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little," she said. "My hip was talking." Mark Anthony nodded. "Weather's changing." "Everything's changing," she said, then went quiet, like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. The coffee machine started its slow gurgle. Mark Anthony opened the blinds. The morning was gray and low, the sky the color of dirty snow. The maple tree in the front yard had lost most of its leaves, and the one still hanging looked tired. A neighbor's trash can lay on its side near the curb, tipped by wind or a raccoon. On the counter, Linda's pill organizer sat open. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. She'd missed Thursday last week and spent the whole next day dizzy and nauseated until Mark Anthony figured it out. "You want toast?" he asked. "I don't know." Mark Anthony pulled bread from the plastic bag anyway. It was starting to go stale around the edges. He placed 2 slices in the toaster and pressed the lever down. Linda sat at the small kitchen table, the one with the vinyl covering that had begun to peel at the corners. She ran her finger along the seam, absent, like she was trying to smooth it back into place. "You call Megan yesterday?" Mark Anthony asked. Linda's eyes stayed on the table. "I did. It went to voicemail." "She is working late again." "She's always working." Mark Anthony watched the coffee drip. "You talked to Ryan?" Linda's mouth tightened. He texted, "Busy week. Call soon." Mark Anthony gave a small grunt that could have meant anything. The toaster popped. Mark Anthony buttered the toast, set a plate in front of Linda, then poured coffee into 2 mugs. Linda's mug had a faded red heart that used to be bright. He sat across from her. The chair creaked under his weight. For a while they ate and drank without talking. The only sound was the coffee maker finishing and the low hum of the refrigerator. Linda broke a piece of toast with her fingers instead of biting it. "We need to talk about the roof," she said. Mark Anthony swallowed. "I already talked to Harold." "Harold's not a roofer." "He's got a guy." Linda lifted her eyes. "Mark Anthony, a guy, isn't a plan." Mark Anthony leaned back a little, careful with his knee. "It's not leaking." "It's starting to," Linda said. "In the corner of the guest room, the one with Megan's old bed. I saw it." Mark Anthony's stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with age. "When?" "This morning. It's not dripping yet, but it's dark, like a bruise." Mark Anthony stared at his coffee, watching the surface ripple slightly from his breathing.
"We can handle it," he said, more to himself than her. Linda didn't argue right away. She sat with her hands folded on the table, the skin thin and spotted. A few years ago, she would have been up already, dressed, hair brushed, making a list of phone calls and appointment times. Now, the day seemed to weigh on her shoulders before it even started. After a moment, she said, "Maybe we should ask the kids." Mark Anthony's jaw tightened. For what? For help. Advice. Something. "They've got their own lives," Mark Anthony said. "So do we. Or we did." Mark Anthony set his mug down a little too hard. Coffee sloshed toward the rim. "You want to call them? Call them," he said. "I'm not begging. It's not begging to need help." Mark Anthony didn't answer. He stared out the window at the sideways trash can and felt the day stretch ahead, empty and heavy. By mid-morning, Mark Anthony had his coat on and his keys in hand. The air outside smelled like wet leaves and old wood. He walked to the driveway, where their Chevy Impala sat with a thin layer of dirt on the hood. Linda stood in the doorway watching him. "You sure you're okay to drive?" she asked. Mark Anthony forced a smile. "I'm not 90. "Not yet," Linda said. "I'm going to the hardware store," Mark Anthony said. Linda nodded. "Okay, I'll call Megan again." Mark Anthony didn't respond. They were waiting to see if their kids would still claim them. Sunday came quietly, the way unwanted days often did. Mark Anthony woke later than usual, sunlight already slipping through the blinds. For a brief second, he thought it was a work day and felt the old instinct to hurry, to be useful. Then reality settled back in. Retirement, empty hours, waiting. Linda was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with her robe on, staring at nothing. "What time is it?" Mark Anthony asked. "Almost 10, she said. Megan said she'd call around 11. Mark Anthony nodded, though his chest felt tight. He didn't like appointments that depended on other people's moods. Linda went to the bathroom, moving stiffly. Mark Anthony listened to the sound of running water, the cabinet opening and closing. When she came back, she had brushed her hair and put on a clean sweater, like she was preparing for company that wouldn't physically arrive. They spent the morning pretending it was normal. Mark Anthony read the newspaper, even though he'd already skimmed it online. Linda wiped down the kitchen counters that were already clean. At 10:58, Linda sat on the couch with her phone in her lap. At 11:10, she checked it again. At 11:25, Mark Anthony cleared his throat. She might be running late. Linda nodded too quickly. Of course. At noon, Linda's phone finally rang. She answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." Mark Anthony stayed where he was, sitting in his recliner, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Megan's voice came through loud enough this time, bright, controlled, the way people sound when they're trying to keep life from spilling over. "Mom, I'm sorry I'm late. It's been crazy." "That's okay," Linda said. "We understand." Mark Anthony closed his eyes. They talked about surface things first: work, traffic, the weather. Megan asked how they were doing, and Linda said, "Oh, you know, same as always." Mark Anthony hated that phrase. Eventually, Linda said, "We wanted to talk about the roof." There was a pause. Mark Anthony imagined Megan somewhere clean and modern, coffee nearby, life organized into color-coded blocks. "Okay," Megan said. "What about it?" "It's leaking," Linda said carefully. "Just a little. Your dad patched it, but you'll need a professional," Megan finished. "Yes," Linda said. Another pause. Megan exhaled. "Mom, have you looked into insurance?" Mark Anthony opened his eyes. Linda frowned. "Insurance? Homeowners. Sometimes they cover that kind of thing."
Mark Anthony spoke before Linda could answer. It won't. We checked. Megan went quiet for a second, surprised. Oh. Hi, Dad. Mark Anthony didn't bother softening his voice. Hi. Megan cleared her throat. Okay, so, have you gotten estimates? Not yet, Linda said. We were hoping. Megan interrupted gently but firmly. Mom, I really think you should call around. I can't do much from here. Mark Anthony leaned forward. We weren't asking you to fix it. I know, Megan said quickly. Money's tight for us right now. Linda's shoulders sagged. We're not asking for money, Linda said again, though her voice wavered. Megan sounded relieved. Good, because I just can't take that on. Mark Anthony swallowed something bitter. Megan continued. Maybe it's time to think about downsizing. That house is a lot. The word hung in the air. Linda blinked. Downsizing? You know, Megan said. Something smaller. Less maintenance. Mark Anthony felt heat rise in his chest. This is our home. I know, Megan said. I'm just thinking practically.
Mark Anthony laughed once, short and sharp. Practical for who? Linda touched his arm, warning. Megan said, Dad, please don't get defensive. Mark Anthony stood up. I'm not defensive. I'm tired. There was silence on the line. Linda said softly, Megan, your dad. I just think, Megan said, sounding strained now, that you two expect too much sometimes. Mark Anthony froze. Linda's hand dropped from his arm. Expect too much? Linda repeated. Well, Megan said, emotional support, constant check-ins, it's a lot. We have our own families. Mark Anthony felt something crack, slow and quiet. Linda whispered, We don't mean to be a burden. Megan didn't answer right away. Mark Anthony leaned over and took the phone gently from Linda's hand. Megan, he said, voice steady despite everything. When you were sick at 6 years old, your mother slept on the floor next to your bed for 3 nights straight. Megan inhaled sharply. Dad. When you couldn't afford rent your first year out of college, we emptied our savings without telling you. Mark Anthony continued. We never called it a burden. Linda's eyes filled. Megan's voice softened. I didn't say you were a burden. Mark Anthony nodded even though she couldn't see him. You didn't have to. There was a long pause. Finally, Megan said, I have to go. The kids are getting restless. Linda reached for the phone again. We love you. I love you too, Megan said quickly, like she needed to say it before guilt caught her. The call ended. The house felt heavier than before. Linda sat very still, staring at the blank phone screen. Mark Anthony lowered himself back into the recliner. His knees hurt, his chest hurt. Everything hurt in a way no medication fixed. After a while, Linda said, Maybe she's right. Mark Anthony looked at her. About what? Maybe we are. Too much. Mark Anthony shook his head slowly. Needing your children doesn't make you a burden. Linda's voice broke. It does when they see it that way. The afternoon passed in silence. Later, Mark Anthony went to check the roof from the yard. The top held, but barely. He knew it wouldn't last the winter. As the sun went down, Linda sat beside him on the couch, her head resting against his shoulder. Do you think Ryan feels the same way? She asked. Mark Anthony didn't answer immediately. I think, he said carefully, that they don't see us as people anymore. Just responsibilities they don't have time for. Linda closed her eyes. That night, Mark Anthony lay awake listening to Linda breathe, thinking about all the years they'd spent being needed. Rides to school, late-night advice, emergency money, unconditional presence. Now, needing something back felt like asking for too much. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the house. And for the first time, Mark Anthony wondered not how long the roof would last, but how long they would. Winter arrived without ceremony. It didn't come in a dramatic storm or a single heavy snowfall. It crept in through colder mornings, stiff joints, and the way the house never seemed warm enough no matter how high Mark Anthony turned the thermostat. The tarp on the roof held through November. By December, it began to sag. Mark Anthony noticed it first from the driveway one morning. The plastic bowed inward like a tired spine. He stood there longer than necessary, coat unzipped, cold seeping through his shoes. Linda opened the door behind him. "What is it?" He didn't turn around. "Nothing." She stepped beside him and followed his gaze upward. She didn't say anything, but he felt the shift in her breathing. Inside, the guest room smelled faintly damp. Linda placed a bowl on the floor beneath the stain, just in case. Neither of them mentioned it again. The first fall happened on a Tuesday. Mark Anthony had gone down to the basement to get the box of holiday decorations. The stairs were narrow and steep, the light dimmer than it used to be. He'd told himself 100 times to replace the bulb. Halfway down, his foot slipped. It wasn't dramatic. No flying limbs or loud crash. Just a sudden loss of balance and a sharp pain that bloomed fast and hot along his side. He lay there for a moment stunned, staring at the underside of the steps. "Mark Anthony?" Linda's voice floated down, thin with concern. "You okay?" "I'm fine," he said automatically. It took him nearly a full minute to stand. When he came back upstairs, his face had gone pale. Linda noticed immediately. "You fell," she said. "Slipped," he corrected. She helped him into a chair. "Does anything hurt?" "My pride," he said, forcing a smile. Linda didn't smile back. She pressed her hand against his ribs gently. Mark Anthony winced despite himself. "Mark," she said quietly, "this isn't nothing." He didn't argue. He was too tired. That night, when he tried to roll over in bed, pain shot through his side and stole his breath. Linda woke up instantly. "We should go to the doctor," she said. "It'll pass." "It won't," she said, firmer now. They went the next morning. The doctor was young, polite, efficient. He pressed, poked, nodded. "Bruised ribs," he said. "No fracture, but you need to be careful. Falls are serious at your age." Mark Anthony bristled at the phrase "your age," but said nothing. The doctor continued. "I'd recommend physical therapy and maybe some modifications at home. Railings, better lighting." Linda nodded eagerly. Mark Anthony stared at the floor. On the drive home, Linda said, "We should tell the kids." Mark Anthony tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Not yet." "Mark, not yet," he repeated. Linda looked out the window. Ryan called 2 days later. Mark Anthony was surprised enough by the call that he answered immediately. "Hey, Dad," Ryan said. "Mom said you took a fall." Mark Anthony closed his eyes briefly, so she told him anyway. "I'm fine," he said. Ryan exhaled. "Jesus, you scared her." "I didn't mean to." "Are you okay?" Ryan asked, and there was genuine concern there. Mark Anthony heard it. "Bruised ribs," Mark Anthony said. "Nothing broken." "That's still serious," Ryan said. "You shouldn't be messing around on ladders and stairs." Mark Anthony said nothing. Ryan continued. "Have you thought about extra help?" Mark Anthony's jaw tightened. "What kind of help?" "Like someone coming by," Ryan said. "Once or twice a week, just to check in, help with stuff." "We don't need a babysitter," Mark Anthony said. Ryan sighed. "Dad, that's not what I meant. It's what it sounds like." There was a pause. Ryan said, more carefully now, "I just don't want to get a call one day that something happened and nobody was there." Mark Anthony stared at the wall. You already wouldn't be there. Ryan didn't answer right away. That's not fair, Ryan said eventually. Mark Anthony almost laughed. Almost. They ended the call without resolution. Linda watched Mark Anthony set the phone down. He cares, she said softly. Mark Anthony didn't respond. The second fall happened at night. Linda heard it before she saw it. The dull thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath. She rushed into the hallway and found Mark Anthony on the floor, one hand braced against the wall. I'm okay, he said again, out of habit. Linda knelt beside him. Don't move. This time, she didn't ask permission. The ER smelled like disinfectant and tired people. Mark Anthony sat in a wheelchair, feeling exposed. Linda hovered close, holding his coat. The nurse asked questions slowly and loudly. Mark Anthony answered quietly, embarrassed. They waited for hours. The diagnosis was simple. No broken bones, but weakened balance, blood pressure fluctuations. You're at risk, the doctor said. You need support at home. Linda nodded immediately. Mark Anthony felt small. At home, Linda made soup they barely touched. That night, she said, we can't keep pretending this is temporary. Mark Anthony stared at the ceiling. What are you saying? I'm saying, Linda said carefully, that we may need help, real help. Mark Anthony turned toward her. From who? Linda hesitated. From somewhere. The word hung between them. Mark Anthony understood what she meant. An agency, a facility, somewhere that wasn't home. No, he said immediately. Linda's voice shook. I'm scared, Mark. Silence. After a long time, Mark Anthony said, I am too. A week later, Megan called. She'd heard from Linda. I think it might be time to talk about options, Megan said gently. Mark Anthony listened without interrupting as Megan listed them: assisted living, short-term rehab, safety. Linda sat beside him, hands folded tight. And there's a really nice place near us, Megan added, just temporarily, until things stabilize. Mark Anthony closed his eyes. Temporary was a word people used to make permanent things easier to swallow. Linda said softly, We'll think about it. After the call ended, Mark Anthony sat very still. I don't want to die somewhere else, he said finally. Linda reached for his hand. Don't forget to click the like and don't miss the end and details of the emotional story.
Won't die. We're just talking. Mark Anthony looked at her. This house knows us. Linda's tears fell freely now. I don't want to lose you because we were too proud. Mark Anthony squeezed her hand weakly. That night, the roof leaked again, just a steady drip into the bowl. Mark Anthony listened to the sound in the dark, each drop marking time. For the first time, he wondered if staying wasn't strength anymore, but stubbornness. And somewhere between the leaking roof, the quiet phone calls, and the bruises that wouldn't fade, Mark Anthony felt the shape of his life changing into something he never imagined. Something smaller, something dependent, something dangerously close to being called a burden.
The place smelled like lemon cleaner and overcooked vegetables. Mark Anthony noticed it the moment they walked in. The air was warm in a way that felt artificial, like it was trying too hard to be comforting. The walls were painted a soft beige, decorated with framed prints of lakes and mountains, places meant to suggest peace, not reality. Linda held his arm as they followed the woman from admissions down the hallway. This is Maple Grove Assisted Living, the woman said brightly. We focus on dignity, independence, and community. Mark Anthony nodded without listening. They passed open doors. Inside, people sat in recliners, staring at televisions turned up too loud. One man slept with his mouth open. A woman folded and refolded the same napkin on her lap. Mark Anthony felt his chest tighten. Linda squeezed his arm, as if she felt it too. The woman continued. We offer 3 meals a day, housekeeping, medication management, and social activities. What about privacy? Mark Anthony asked. The woman smiled. Of course, everyone has their own room. Room, not home. They stopped in front of a door. The woman opened it with a flourish. This is one of our standard units. It was clean, small, a bed, a dresser, a window overlooking the parking lot. Mark Anthony stepped inside. The carpet muted his footsteps, made him feel like he was already disappearing. Linda stood in the doorway, hands clasped. This would just be temporary, the woman said again, as if reading their minds. Until things feel more manageable. Mark Anthony looked out the window. A family was loading groceries into an SUV. The kids were laughing. How much? Mark Anthony asked. The woman named a number. Linda inhaled sharply. Mark Anthony nodded. Thank you. The woman handed Linda a brochure. Take your time. But Mark Anthony knew they wouldn't. They didn't talk much on the drive home. Linda stared out the window, brochure folded and unfolded in her hands. Mark Anthony watched the road, the familiar turns feeling suddenly fragile, like memories that could slip away. At home, the house felt quieter than ever. The drip in the guest room had stopped, but the stain had grown. Mark Anthony sat at the kitchen table and spread out the bills. The numbers didn't change no matter how long he stared at them. Linda sat across from him. We can't afford it long term. Mark Anthony nodded. I know. Linda hesitated. Megan said she could help. For a little while. Mark Anthony looked up. Help how? She said we could use the proceeds from selling the house, Linda said carefully. Mark Anthony's throat tightened. Selling. She says it makes sense, Linda continued. That the house is too much. Mark Anthony pushed his chair back. She doesn't get to decide that. Linda flinched. She's trying to help. By erasing us? Mark Anthony snapped. Linda stood. That's not fair. Mark Anthony stood too, then immediately regretted it as pain shot through his side. He sat back down heavily. Linda rushed to him. I'm sorry, please don't. Mark Anthony waved her off. I hate this. I know, Linda whispered. Ryan visited the next weekend. It had been months since he'd been inside the house. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, taller than Mark Anthony remembered, his hair starting to thin in the same places. Hey, Dad, he said. Hey, Mark Anthony replied. Ryan hugged Linda carefully, like she might break. They sat in the living room. Ryan glanced around, his eyes lingering on the old furniture, the family photos. It smells the same, Ryan said, trying to smile. Linda laughed softly. That's probably not a good thing. Ryan cleared his throat. Megan, fill me in. Mark Anthony folded his arms. I figured. Ryan leaned forward. We're worried. So you keep saying. Ryan hesitated. Dad, you fell twice. Mark Anthony looked at him. And you weren't here either time. Ryan flinched. That's exactly it, Mark Anthony said quietly. Silence settled between them. Ryan said, I wish I could be. Mark Anthony nodded. So do I. Ryan exhaled slowly. I can't be your safety net. Mark Anthony felt the words land heavy. I didn't ask you to be, he said. Ryan shook his head. That's the thing. You shouldn't have to. Linda spoke up gently. We just don't want to lose our home. Ryan looked at her. Mom, we don't want to lose you. Mark Anthony stared at the wall. Ryan continued. If something happens and you're alone, Mark Anthony interrupted, then you'll feel guilty. Is that it? Ryan's face tightened. That's not fair.
Mark Anthony almost laughed again. Almost. Everything about this is unfair, Mark Anthony said. That night, after Ryan left, Linda sat on the edge of the bed. I think we need to accept help, she said. Mark Anthony stared at the ceiling. I don't want to be put away, he said. Linda turned toward him. I don't want to bury you. Mark Anthony closed his eyes. The next morning, Megan sent links. Facilities, pricing, reviews.
Mark Anthony didn't click any of them. A week later, Linda filled out paperwork anyway. Mark Anthony watched her from the doorway, the pen shaking in her hand. Are you mad at me? She asked quietly. Mark Anthony shook his head. I'm mad at time. Linda nodded. Me too. They packed a small bag together. Just essentials, just in case. Mark Anthony folded his clothes carefully, like he was preparing for a trip he didn't want to take. When the bag was zipped, it felt final. Linda sat beside him on the bed. We'll do this together. Mark Anthony reached for her hand. Promise me something. What? Don't let them forget us. Linda pressed her forehead to his shoulder. I won't. But even as she said it, Mark Anthony could feel the truth slipping. The decision had been made, not loudly, not cruelly, just efficiently. And somewhere between concern and convenience, Mark Anthony realized something he'd never thought possible. His children hadn't chosen abandonment. They'd chosen distance. And called it care. Move-in day didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like something being set down carefully so no one had to carry it anymore. Mark Anthony sat in the passenger seat while Linda drove. The car was quiet except for the turn signal clicking too loudly. Their small overnight bag rested in the back seat, zipped tight like it was holding its breath. Neither of them spoke. When they pulled into Maple Grove's parking lot, Mark Anthony noticed how full it was. Rows of cars, visitors, staff, families who could leave afterward. Linda parked and turned off the engine. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel. We can still go home, Mark Anthony said, not looking at her. Linda swallowed. Just for a little while. Temporary again. Inside, the same lemon cleaner smell greeted them. A different staff member checked them in, cheerful and efficient. Mark Anthony signed where he was told. His signature looked shaky on the page. This will be Mark Anthony's room, the nurse said, opening the door. Room 214. Linda stepped inside first. Mark Anthony followed. The room looked exactly like it had during the tour. Bed, dresser, chair, window, neutral, forgettable. Linda placed his bag on the bed and began unpacking slowly, like she was trying to stretch time. Mark Anthony sat in the chair and watched. The nurse explained medication schedules, meal times, emergency buttons. Mark Anthony nodded at the right moments. Any questions? The nurse asked. Mark Anthony shook his head. Linda asked, How often can I visit? Anytime, the nurse said. Family is encouraged. Encouraged wasn't promised. When the nurse left, the silence felt heavier. Linda smoothed the blanket on the bed. I'll bring more of your things tomorrow. Mark Anthony looked at her. You don't have to. Yes, I do, she said. You need familiar things. He almost said you're familiar, but didn't. Linda hugged him then, tightly, longer than usual. I'll come back this evening, she said. Mark Anthony nodded. She hesitated at the door. You'll be okay? Mark Anthony forced a small smile. I've handled worse. Linda nodded, then left. The door clicked shut. Mark Anthony stared at it. The first night was the hardest. The bed was comfortable but wrong. The sheets smelled like detergent that wasn't theirs. The hallway light stayed on all night, bleeding under the door. Mark Anthony didn't sleep much.
He listened to sounds, coughing, footsteps, a woman crying softly somewhere down the hall. At 3 a.m., a staff member peeked in. "Everything okay?" Mark Anthony nodded. She smiled and moved on. He turned toward the window. The parking lot lights cast long shadows. His house was only 20 minutes away. It felt like another country. Days settled into routine faster than Mark Anthony expected. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. The food was fine, bland, but filling. Staff called him Mr. Callahan, in voices meant to sound warm. Other residents smiled at him without really seeing him. At activities hour, someone suggested bingo. Mark Anthony declined. He walked the halls instead, slow laps, hand brushing the wall for balance. Linda visited every day that first week. She brought his sweater, his old alarm clock, framed photos. She stayed for hours, talking about nothing. But when she left, the room shrank again. Megan visited once. She brought flowers and a tense smile. "Dad," she said brightly, "this place is nice, right?" Mark Anthony nodded. "It's clean." Megan laughed nervously. "See? That's good." She talked about work, the kids, her schedule. She avoided looking directly at the bed. After an hour, she checked her phone. "I should go, but I'll come again soon." Mark Anthony nodded again. She hugged him quickly, like she was late for something important. Ryan didn't come. He called once, promised to visit when things calmed down. Things never did.
One afternoon, Mark Anthony overheard a staff member talking in the hallway. "Room 214 needs assistance," she said into a radio. Room 214. Not Mark, not Dad, not husband. A room. That night he didn't tell Linda. Linda's visits grew shorter. Not because she cared less, because she was tired. The drive, the guilt, the way Mark Anthony tried to look okay so she wouldn't worry. One evening, she arrived looking pale. "I forgot the time," she said. "I'm sorry." Mark Anthony waved it off. "You came." She smiled weakly. As she left, she paused. "Ryan texted. He says hello." Mark Anthony nodded. "Do you want me to ask him to come?" she asked. Mark Anthony shook his head. "Don't beg." Linda's eyes filled. "I never thought this would be our life." Mark Anthony took her hand. "Neither did I." Weeks passed. Mark Anthony stopped correcting people when they spoke over him. He started attending bingo. He learned which nurses rushed and which listened. He learned how easy it was to disappear quietly. One morning he woke up and couldn't remember what day it was. It scared him more than the falls. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands shaking slightly, and waited for the fear to pass. No one noticed. On a Sunday afternoon, Mark Anthony sat by the window watching families arrive and leave. Children ran ahead of parents. Doors opened, doors closed. He wondered when he'd become someone people visited instead of someone they lived with. That night, Linda didn't come. She called instead. "I'm not feeling well." "That's okay," Mark Anthony said quickly. "Rest." After the call, he sat alone in the dim room. He looked at the framed photo Linda had brought, Megan laughing at graduation. He whispered, "We tried." The room didn't answer. A nurse came in to help him to bed. "You're doing great," she said kindly. Mark Anthony nodded. As she turned off the light, he felt something settle inside him. Not peace, not anger, acceptance. Not the healthy kind, the kind that happens when resistance feels pointless. Mark Anthony lay awake thinking about how easy it had been. Not the falls, not the illness, but the letting go. How quickly a life could be reduced to a schedule, a room number, a responsibility shifted elsewhere. And in the quiet, Mark Anthony understood something with painful clarity. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been managed. Placed somewhere safe, out of the way. Ryan didn't come. He called once, promised to visit when things calmed down. Things never did. One afternoon, Mark Anthony overheard a staff member talking in the hallway. "Room 214 needs assistance," she said into her radio. Room 214, not Mark, not Dad, not husband, a room. That night, he didn't tell Linda. Linda's visits grew shorter. Not because she cared less, because she was tired, the drive, the guilt, the way Mark Anthony tried to look okay so she wouldn't worry. One evening, she arrived looking pale. "I forgot the time," she said. "I'm sorry." Mark Anthony waved it off. "You came." She smiled weakly. As she left, she paused. "Ryan texted. He says hello." Mark Anthony nodded. "Do you want me to ask him to come?" she asked. Mark Anthony shook his head. "Don't beg." Linda's eyes filled. "I never thought this would be our life." Mark Anthony took her hand. "Neither did I." Weeks passed. Mark Anthony stopped correcting people when they spoke over him. He started attending bingo. He learned which nurses rushed and which listened. He learned how easy it was to disappear quietly. One morning, he woke up and couldn't remember what day it was. It scared him more than the falls. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands shaking slightly, and waited for the fear to pass. No one noticed. On a Sunday afternoon, Mark Anthony sat by the window watching families arrive and leave. Children ran ahead of parents. Doors opened, doors closed. He wondered when he'd become someone people visited instead of someone they lived with. That night, Linda didn't come. She called instead. "I'm not feeling well." "That's okay," Mark Anthony said quickly. "Rest." After the call, he sat alone in the dim room. He looked at the framed photo Linda had brought, Megan laughing at graduation. He whispered, "We tried." The room didn't answer. A nurse came in to help him to bed. "You're doing great," she said kindly. Mark Anthony nodded. As she turned off the light, he felt something settle inside him. Not peace, not anger. Acceptance, not the healthy kind. The kind that happens when resistance feels pointless. Mark Anthony lay awake thinking about how easy it had been, not the falls, not the illness, but the letting go. How quickly a life could be reduced to a schedule, a room number, a responsibility shifted elsewhere. And in the quiet, Mark Anthony understood something with painful clarity. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been managed, placed somewhere safe, out of the way. Linda stopped visiting every day. It wasn't sudden. It happened the way erosion happens. Slow. Unnoticed at first, then undeniable. At first it was a missed morning visit, replaced with an afternoon one. Then a phone call instead of a visit. Then 2 days between seeing her face in person. Mark Anthony never complained. He learned to say, "That's okay," before she could apologize. He didn't want to be another thing she had to carry. The first time Linda forgot to bring his medication list to an appointment, Mark Anthony knew something was wrong. They sat in a small exam room while the nurse waited patiently. "I had it written down," Linda said, rifling through her purse. "I swear I did." "It's fine," Mark Anthony said. "They have it here." But Linda's hands shook as she searched. The nurse finally said, "We can pull it up." Linda let out a breath that sounded like relief mixed with shame. On the drive back to Maple Grove, Linda missed a turn. Mark Anthony noticed but didn't say anything. When she corrected herself too late, she laughed nervously. "Guess I'm getting old too." Mark Anthony stared out the window. Linda started looking thinner. Her clothes hung on her. Dark circles formed under her eyes. "You're not eating," Mark Anthony said one afternoon. "I am," she lied. She started bringing store-bought cookies instead of homemade ones. She sat more when she visited, rubbing her lower back absent-mindedly. "You should see a doctor," Mark Anthony said. She waved him off. After things settle, they never did. Ryan finally visited. It had been over a month. He walked into room 214 with an uncertain smile, like he wasn't sure who he'd find there. "Hey, Dad." Mark Anthony looked up from the chair. "Hey." Ryan hesitated, then hugged him. The hug was stiff, careful. "You look okay," Ryan said. Mark Anthony nodded. "I am." They talked about neutral things: sports, weather, work. Ryan glanced at the calendar on the wall. "Mom not coming today." "She was here yesterday," Mark Anthony said. Ryan exhaled. "She shouldn't be doing this alone." Mark Anthony looked at him. "She is." Ryan swallowed. "I didn't mean." "You didn't come," Mark Anthony said simply. Ryan's face tightened. "I know." Silence. Ryan said, "We thought this was best." Mark Anthony studied his son's face. "Best for who?" Ryan didn't answer. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Mark Anthony was eating oatmeal when a nurse approached him gently. "Mr. Callahan, your wife has been taken to the hospital." Mark Anthony felt the room tilt. "What?" he said. "She collapsed at home," the nurse said. "She's stable, but they wanted to notify you." Mark Anthony stood too fast. Pain flared in his side, but he barely noticed. "I need to go," he said. "We'll arrange transport," the nurse said calmly. Mark Anthony sat back down, hands gripping the table. For the first time since arriving at Maple Grove, he felt afraid in a way that had nothing to do with falling. Linda lay in a hospital bed when Mark Anthony arrived. She looked smaller than ever. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Mark." He took her hand. "What happened?" "Just dizzy," she said. "I guess I pushed too hard." A doctor explained. "Exhaustion, dehydration, stress. She needs support," the doctor said gently. "Caregiver burnout is real." Mark Anthony closed his eyes. Support. The word echoed bitterly. Ryan and Megan arrived later that day. Megan looked shaken. "Mom, you should have told us." Linda tried to smile. "I didn't want to worry you." Mark Anthony watched his children stand there, guilt finally visible on their faces. Ryan said quietly, "We didn't realize." Mark Anthony looked at him. "You didn't want to." Silence fell heavy. Megan's eyes filled. "That's not fair." Mark Anthony's voice was steady. "Neither was this." Linda squeezed his hand weakly. "Please." Mark Anthony softened. "I'm sorry." But the truth remained between them. Linda stayed in the hospital for 4 days. After that, she wasn't allowed to go home alone. The social worker spoke gently, firmly. "We need to discuss options." Options again. This time they included Linda joining Mark Anthony at Maple Grove. The idea landed like a final door closing. Linda cried quietly that night. "I failed you," she said. Mark Anthony held her as best he could. "No, you carried us until you couldn't." A week later, Linda moved into the room next to his. Room 216. They held hands in the hallway, both of them tired, both of them smaller than they used to be. Megan promised to visit more. Ryan promised to call weekly. They meant it. For a while. One evening, as Mark Anthony helped Linda into her bed, she looked at him with sudden clarity. "Do you remember," she said, "when we promised we'd never do this to each other?" Mark Anthony nodded. "I thought if I loved you enough," she whispered, "it would be enough." Mark Anthony brushed her hair back gently. It was. They sat in silence, the hallway light bleeding under the doors of their separate rooms. Mark Anthony returned to his room alone. He sat in the chair and stared at the wall. For the first time, the thought came fully formed and undeniable. They hadn't been abandoned because they were unloved. They'd been abandoned because love had limits. Limits defined by time, inconvenience, and distance. And as Mark Anthony lay down that night, listening to the soft sounds of the facility around him, he wondered how many people ended up here, not because they had nowhere to go, but because everyone else did. Time didn't stop at Maple Grove. It thinned. Days blurred into each other, marked less by calendars and more by routines. Medication times, meal trays, visiting hours. Mark Anthony learned to measure life in smaller units. Good mornings, bad nights, moments when Linda smiled without effort. They saw each other every day now. Sometimes they sat together in the common room without speaking. Sometimes Mark Anthony wheeled Linda outside when the weather allowed, the sun warming their faces like a reminder that the world still existed beyond beige walls and scheduled care. Their children visited. Not often, not rarely either. Enough to say they tried. Megan came once every 2 weeks. Ryan called on Sundays, sometimes missed a week. Apologies came easily. Time didn't. Mark Anthony stopped expecting more. Linda declined slowly, not dramatically, not all at once. She forgot words, then names, then days. One afternoon, she looked at Mark Anthony and said, "You seem kind." It broke him in a way nothing else had. He smiled and said, "I've known you a long time." She laughed softly, not understanding. That night, Mark Anthony sat alone in his room and cried quietly into his hands, careful not to make a sound. Linda passed away on a Tuesday morning. Mark Anthony wasn't there. He had gone to breakfast, thinking he had time. By the time the nurse found him, it was over. Linda looked peaceful, smaller than ever. Mark Anthony held her hand long after it had gone cold. Megan arrived crying, collapsing into his arms. Ryan stood stiffly by the door, guilt written across his face. "I'm sorry," Megan kept saying. Mark Anthony nodded. "I know." The funeral was small. People said the right things. She lived a good life. She's at peace now. Mark Anthony thanked them all. Afterward, he returned to Maple Grove alone. Room 214 felt quieter. Weeks passed. Mark Anthony stopped attending activities altogether. He spent most of his time by the window. One afternoon, a new nurse sat with him. "Do you have family?" she asked gently. Mark Anthony thought for a moment. "Yes," he said. "They're busy." She nodded, understanding more than she said. One evening, Mark Anthony took out a notebook Linda had packed for him months earlier. He hadn't opened it until now. On the first page, he began to write, not angrily, not bitterly, just honestly. He wrote about working overtime so his kids could have better lives, about missed vacations, delayed dreams, sacrifices no one remembered because they were never meant to be remembered. He wrote about love that didn't disappear, but changed into something distant. He wrote about how aging didn't make him weak. It made him invisible. Mark Anthony passed away quietly one early morning. A nurse found him sitting in his chair, notebook on his lap, pen still in his hand. No one was with him. Megan arrived too late. Ryan arrived with red eyes and shaking hands. They stood in the doorway of room 214, unsure where to stand, unsure what to say. The nurse handed Megan the notebook. "This might matter to you," she said. That night, Megan read. Ryan listened. They didn't interrupt. When they finished, the house felt too quiet. Ryan finally said, "We should have done better." Megan nodded. "We thought being busy was an excuse." They sat with the truth long after the lights were off. This is not just Mark Anthony's story. It is happening quietly every day in homes, hospitals, and care facilities across the country, and most people don't notice until it's too late. The end.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more real-life stories.